On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, two of Mr. Trump's former aides in serious legal trouble. What could this mean for the U.S. president? And inter-Korean diplomacy in full swing, with family reunions and easing at the border. Could they keep the momentum going? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our show today with the White House in damage control after two men with close ties to the U.S. president were convicted on federal charges. Donald Trump is slamming his former personal attorney, while at the same time he's praising the former head of his election campaign. Before our discussion about him, let's take a look at this.
Brushing off the explosive charges by Donald Trump's former lawyer, the White House said the president is innocent.
As the president has stated on numerous occasions, he did nothing wrong. There are no charges against him in this. And just because Michael Cohen made a plea deal doesn't mean that that implicates the president on anything.
That is a narrow interpretation of what happened Tuesday in court, where Michael Cohen said he was directed by the U.S. president to pay hush money to two women who claimed that they have had affairs with Donald Trump. The payments were illegal under U.S. campaign finance laws. Tuesday also saw the conviction of Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, on 8 charges, including tax evasion and bank fraud. The U.S. president took to Twitter to defend Manafort and criticize Cohen and the U.S. justice system, saying, "I feel very badly for Paul Manafort and his wonderful family. Justice took a 12-year-old tax case, among other things, applied tremendous pressure on him, and unlike Michael Cohen, he refused to make up stories in order to get a deal. Such respect for a brave man." That tweet fed speculation that the president might use his powers to pardon Manafort, who is facing at least one other trial and could go to prison for the rest of his life. Michael Cohen's lawyer, meanwhile, says his client wouldn't accept a pardon from the president and has more information on Trump's actions during the 2016 presidential election, including possible collusion with Russia.
The answer is definitively no, under no circumstances, since he came to the judgment after Mr. Trump's election to the president of the United States that his suitability is a serious risk to our country. And certainly after Helsinki creates serious questions about his loyalty to our country, his answer would be no, I do not want a pardon from this man.
So in an incredible turn of events, Michael Cohen, who famously once said that he would take a bullet for the U.S. president, now has his finger on a political and legal trigger that, if pulled, could imperil the presidency of his former boss.
For more on the latest drama from Trump's inner circle, let's turn to our panelists. We have a strong panel in Beijing. Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. Welcome, sir. In Washington, D.C., Bruce Fein, an American lawyer and former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. In Iowa City, we invited Timothy Hagel, a professor of political science from the University of Iowa. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Well, what a circus going on over there. The question is it a time to talk about impeachment or not? Let's go to Professor Hagel.
Well, I don't think it really is the time to talk about impeachment, but of course a number of people already are, some Democrats at least, although other Democrats are a little cautious about throwing around that word. But we have heard it from a number of sources, particularly, of course, and not surprisingly, from those that oppose President Trump. But we do need to see some sort of concrete evidence, and it's a problem for President Trump in the sense that a number of his associates, Manafort, Flynn, Cohen, have been convicted in various ways, and that closeness to Trump causes problems for President Trump, but there still needs to be some sort of direct connection, and we aren't really going to know that until Mueller concludes his investigation.
Right. Mr. Fein, one of the most important things is whether Mr. Trump used the campaign money or his team used the campaign money to pay to the two ladies, of course, who are now in quite some drama with Mr. Trump. Do we know much with the public information as to how much really the arrow is pointing to the direction of the campaign money? That's the big issue.
Well, Mr. Trump himself has said he paid the money personally. There's other testimony and wire information that suggests at least some of the payments came out of a corporation that was controlled by Mr. Trump that would also be illegal. Mr. Trump did not disclose the information. And with regard to impeachment, the president himself, Mr. Trump, raised the so-called I word yesterday and said, well, if I'm impeached, the economics of the United States will follow into a doldrums. Obviously, we don't have articles of impeachment yet because, as pointed out, we don't have the investigation concluded. But we need to understand it's not just Mueller's investigation. Mr. Cohen's problems arose with the Southern District of New York. This is a United States Attorney's Office that's populated by people appointed by President Trump. And the Deputy United States Attorney, who's now acting the U.S. Attorney because there's been a recusal for the top post, explicitly stated after the Cohen plea that the President of the United States orchestrated the illegal payments to one porn star and another Playboy bunny who had affairs allegedly 10 years ago. You can't get any more direct implication than that involving the President. It may be false, but it's just like an eyewitness to a murder. Maybe you can say the murder didn't happen, but an eyewitness is as close as you can get to evidence.
Right.
I do think, however, that with regard to impeachment, unless the Democrats get control of the House in November, the Republicans would drag their feet for as long as possible.
I see. Let's talk about whether there is evidence, and those evidence are concrete enough for campaign money or not. At least Mr. Trump's longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, said he directed the hush money, quote, in coordination and at the direction of a candidate for federal office. If we could just reveal some of those. A thinly veiled reference to Trump. He sent a $130,000 payment to former porn star Stormy Daniels, and another $150,000 payment was sent to former Playboy model Karen McDougal. Both alleged that they had affairs with Mr. Trump. Well, Mr. Tangen, Mr. Fain said it very articulatively. That is, whether or not something is true or not will not matter that much in front of the law, but rather evidence. Evidence does matter. Do you see much evidence as a, as a commentator who has been working around the 24-hour news cycle about the so-called campaign money or not?
I served for a year. I'm an attorney, and I served for a year as in the prosecutor's office in Milwaukee County. I can tell you for certain that it will come down to evidence, and the evidence is Donald Trump's own words. We've all heard the tapes. He's indicated that he knew about this prior to what he has said. Obviously, both situations cannot be true. He either knew afterwards or he knew before. We have him discussing it with his attorney on tape 2 months prior to any kind of disclosure. So I think that's extremely damning. That is what is going to be the determining factor here. Not he said, she said. It is just simply what the facts say, what the tape says.
Well, Professor Hagel, so impeachment seemed to be the word a lot of Democrats use, but Nancy Pelosi, for example, has been suggesting rather than so-called the impeachment process right now, the Democrats should rely more on the criminal investigation against the Trump administration and probably against the president himself. So between those two choices, what do you think are the articulations and the arguments?
Well, between impeachment or indictment, an actual criminal charge against the president, the latter, an indictment, a criminal charge, it's not clear that that's possible. There's some that argue that a sitting president can't be indicted, can't be charged with a crime and brought to trial. We, of course, have the situation with President Clinton, who not in a criminal trial but in a civil trial was forced to testify. So there is that to think about. but there is some basic disagreement among the experts as to whether a sitting president can be brought to trial. But it seems pretty clear, on the other hand, that if there's enough evidence to bring someone to trial to indict that person, the president, then that person probably could be impeached, removed from office, and then charged with a crime. The problem, of course, politically is that even if the Democrats take control of the House after the midterm elections here, that the Senate would probably still be, and we'll have to wait and see, but they'd probably still be in Republican control. So even if the House decides to impeach the president, it's the Senate that has the ability to actually remove the president from office, and that's not likely to happen.
On the other hand, Mr. Fain, we see that there are different kinds of investigation going on, as you just mentioned. One, of course, is the Mueller investigation that everybody is very well aware of the latest development. The other could be criminal investigations. Actually, some are already going on, for example, in the state of New York right now. Therefore, what pace and rhythm of these investigations should we pay attention to, particularly with the upcoming midterm election? In other words, will these investigations, in other words, sir, if I could clarify myself, that is, will these investigations really matter politically? That is really about the reason before leading up to the midterm election. Sir, go ahead.
Well, I think the answer is yes. Let me amplify a little bit on the earlier answer, and that is I participated in the so-called Bork Memorandum in 1973 about whether or not President Nixon could be prosecuted while he was in office. He was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. The prosecution issue washed out because he resigned. But the opinion makes a clear distinction between being charged, indicted, as opposed prosecuted, which would mean really the shutdown of the executive branch. So I believe that even consistent with the Department of Justice regulations as currently existing, President Trump could be indicted even if he wasn't prosecuted. The indictment would be presented to the House of Representatives to determine whether that was worthy of an impeachable article or whether they wanted to continue further investigation. But the critical piece of evidence, I think, that remains unknown in all of its contours is this June 2016 meeting between Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner, with basically cutouts of Vladimir Putin's Russian's president to receive dirt on Hillary Clinton. According to a recent book written by Mike Isikoff and David Korn, during that meeting, Mr. Manafort and Donald Trump Jr. solicited. They asked, well, where's the dirt on Hillary Clinton? Because they had been told that in advance. Soliciting information of value from a foreign government is itself a crime. Now, we don't know exactly what was Mr. Trump Sr.'s involvement in this, but surely you could give immunity to Mr. Manafort and compel him to testify. What did Mr. Trump Sr. know about this? If it comes forth that he knew about it in advance, it's a conspiracy, and I think even Republicans would find it abhorrent that Mr. Trump would seek the assistance of Vladimir Putin to help him win the election, and Mr. Trump's presidency would be at an end.
Professor Hagel, talking about Hillary Clinton, of course, one of the important quotes coming from the very talkative president in the United States is asking the Attorney General to investigate against Hillary Clinton's so-called the other side of the story today, after the Attorney General actually had been quite outspoken about his role inside the United States, not serving the president, but rather the United States' national interest. Having said that, though, what about that, the capability of Donald Trump to turn around the table and also to argue on Twitter, use it as a propaganda machine politically, even in the process of investigations against him and against his inner circles?
Yes, well, you know, of course, that the president uses Twitter unlike anybody else, any high-level official has done, and that was basically part of his strength, is to be able, from his point of view, speak directly with his followers, the American people. On the other hand, his use of Twitter has made many other people very unhappy and has gotten himself into trouble in various ways. Now, some would argue that maybe that's purposeful, to stir up things, create chaos, and Trump thinks that's to his advantage. As far as the asking Hillary Clinton to be investigated and so forth, that's certainly something that a lot of people think should happen. A lot of people, mainly on the political right, Republicans and so forth, that think that she committed some crimes potentially and should be investigated further. We have more information to be learn from there as well. The problem for Trump, though, is that it may be an attempt at a deflection, but you could simply say that, well, two wrongs don't make a right, and some would argue that both people should be investigated to the extent necessary.
But there is the issue of whether the investigation against Trump will be distracted as a result of the other things that is going on, or the other things that the president would love to see go on. Mr. Tangen.
Yeah, Donald Trump has a strong history. If you start looking at his Twitter activity, you'll see that there's a very much of a rhythm, a pattern that has been increasing. As long as he has some sort of issue that's going on, you'll notice that the Twitter increases and that he becomes more varied. He throws in all sorts of things. Today, within the last couple of days, he's been talking about South Africa, about many other issues beyond this. He's trying to use the media as what we call throwing out a white rabbit. And e.g., the press is going to run after it and say, oh, this is silly, you shouldn't do this. But this takes up time, and therefore
he's got a lot of rabbits in the morning.
Exactly, especially at 1 a.m. So, but Donald Trump is fighting for his life. I mean, his family's at risk. He is at risk. His foundation, his fortune, right, his candidacy and his presidency.
Right.
And he's surrounded by people who appear to be cooperating with either Mueller or the Justice Departments of various states.
But here is the danger, Mr. Fain, as a result of the personality and the way of doing things of this president. That is, whether the other issues about the United States' national interests and also even the U.S. bilateral relations with other countries, and also the U.S. role on the international stage is likely to be those white rabbits, as Mr. Tangen earlier humorously put it, thrown out in a way to sacrifice for Mr. Trump's personal political safety as a result of the going on investigation. So that is a big issue for the rest of the world. Mr. Fain, would you help us to understand better about that? Because China's interest is also on the line. There's going on the so-called trade war, but many know that it has a lot to do with the ego of this president.
Well, that's true, but I was through all of Watergate and Nixon's impeachment and resignation. That lasted 18 months, and I can guarantee you the foreign policy and the national security of the United States did not suffer. In fact, we faced the Soviet Union off during the Yom Kippur War. So we have institutional strengths that transcend the personality of the occupant of the office. Moreover, even with regard to Mr. Trump's tenure, if he is removed, we have Michael Pence, who's basically an echo chamber of Mr. Trump, except he's not so vulgar and venomous, and he's perhaps a little bit more conservative on freedom of religion. But it's not like we're going to have a change in policy if Mr. Trump departs. One other item I'd like to address is that I was at the Justice Department for 15 years in the middle of Watergate, and when Nixon tried to shut down the fence, no one would, after why everyone quit, no one would go over to Nixon's office, including myself, and defend him. I believe if Mr. Trump ordered over Mr. Sessions' objection, investigation to begin of Hillary Clinton, he would get a complete resignation from the entire department, and no one would pursue such a clearly politicized investigation. We know Mr. Trump knows nothing about the law. He knows nothing about whether or not evidence establishes a crime.
Wow.
And this is turning the Department of Justice into a political arm.
I'm not sure whether that is exactly going to happen, especially given the argument you just made, Mr. Fain. Professor Hagel, the reason I'm saying that is people have been saying that kind of similar statement from the very beginning of this administration, and eventually we see where we are today, and most of the bureaucrats are not necessarily resigning at this point. So having said that, though, Professor Hagel, I do want to invite your views coming from the domestic political academic angle about whether the U.S. politics is likely to be all about this investigation and everything related to this investigation, as we have witnessed during the Clinton years, or at least some of his Clinton years.
The answer to that is a bit yes and a bit no. That, at least as far as the elections are concerned, this is certainly something that a lot of people, us included, from the media and political pundits want to talk about, and it's certainly something that Democrats want to emphasize in terms of what they see as the corruption in the Trump administration. But for a lot of voters, this is something that they really don't care about. A lot of people don't really like Washington, and this is partly why. What they're concerned about are economic matters, pocketbook matters, kitchen table matters, as we call them. And for them, it's more a matter of things of how are we doing economically? How is my job doing? What's my salary like? Those sorts of things. And a lot of the political stuff kind of goes over their heads. Now, again, to the extent that Democrats are going to emphasize that and Republicans have to defend on it in one way or another, then it does become an issue to some extent, particularly for voters who may be more marginal, and if they don't turn out, that's certainly going to hurt Trump supporters, in particular the Republican candidates in the midterm elections.
Mr. Tangen, of course, both parties are using these investigations and the so-called impeachment or not as their tool to gear up the voters. At the Democrat side, of course, we understand their argument. The Republicans are saying, well, you see, people want to impeach our president, and therefore let's go out and vote. So how do you see this issue? The legal battles related to Mr. Trump and his inner circle are likely to be used politically, and what is likely to be the impact eventually on the November election? Mr. Tangen.
Yeah.
Of course, I know it's a $1 trillion question, but still, your thought.
Well, politics and law are two different things, and as pointed out by my colleague, this will be tried in the House. It will not be finished in New York or some other state. So it'll come down to politics, and there is this incident where people are just not going to be willing to take it. If they like Donald Trump, they'll keep him. So don't expect any big changes, except if he pardons Manafort. People who buy $25,000 ostrich jackets are not the kind of people who voted for Donald Trump, and they would take this as a personal affront.
We'll see what's going to happen. There will be a lot of things going on before November happens. Einar Tangen, Bruce Fain, Timothy Hagel. Gentlemen, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for your insights and analysis. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Family reunions and easing at the border, the latest in inter-Korean diplomacy. Could Seoul and Pyongyang keep the momentum going? We'll get some answers right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Now, let's turn to the Korean Peninsula. South Korea has revised the defense white paper, no longer labeling DPRK government and army as, quote, the enemies. The two sides also agreed to withdraw some outposts along the fortified border. On Friday, the second round of reunions of separated families begin. Look at these two wonderful ladies when they're walking together. Really emotional moments. Emotions are extremely high as the first phase of reunions wrap up on Wednesday in the DPRK.
The time to say farewell has come again. It's been an emotional 3 days for families reuniting for the first time since the 1950s Korean War. And many know that this could be the very last time they see each other.
Let's meet again when we are reunited. Let's meet again. Stay healthy, grandmother. Until the day of reunification, let's meet again.
These reunions began with tears of joy and disbelief. After so much time apart, many were initially unable to recognize their blood relatives. But after the initial shock settled in and identities were confirmed, families exchanged stories and retraced their histories from the past 6 decades.
I came here to encounter my mother directly through her pictures. I have my 2 nephews here, but they were not able to bring her pictures.
Separated families are victims of a war that is technically still ongoing. The majority have spent their lives wondering what happened to their loved ones. Any cross-border communication, written or verbal, is banned by both sides.
You should remember your mother prays for your health and happiness. I hope whenever I pray for you, you will hear it.
As family members return home, many carry mixed emotions. They take comfort in having had the opportunity to make up for lost time. but they also return to the reality of a separated Korean peninsula.
For more on the ongoing family reunions in Korea, we turn to our panelists. With us in Beijing, Yang Xiyu, a senior research fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Good to have you, sir. In Seoul, South Korea, Jim Jung Lim, an assistant professor at the College of International Relations with Ritsumeikan University. And in Boston, U.S., we have Jim Walsh, senior research associate at MIT Security Studies Program. Welcome to all of you. I want to go to you, Ms. Lim, first. When you look at the footages of those family reunions from the North and the South for the 3 days, I just wonder, how is it like for you, like a younger generation raised up in South Korea, looking at those moments?
Okay, thank you again. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for asking that question. Yes, of course, as you mentioned, I don't know about anything, again, what happened during the Korean War. And very fortunately, my family, we don't have any family member who were separated between the North and us. So we were one of a kind of very rare and lucky families in the southern part of the peninsula. But as we observed, there are so many family members, more than like tens of thousands of people who have lived separately for more than just decades and decades. So it is, of course, there can be many different people in the southern part of the peninsula, but at least for this specific issue, I do think we do have a same sympathy, and we really are very saddened by seeing all this scenes. So hopefully, I really hope, we can make more family reunions as much as we can in the near future. Mm-hmm.
We are showing some of those footages of moments of family reunions. Of course, every slice of photo is absolutely emotional, and I'm already having tears in my eyes thinking about what if our families were separated. But Mr. Yang, for you who have been researching about the Korean Peninsula for long, you know that this is only one of the very few chances that the families from each side of the border could be able to come together. And by the way, it's only 3 days, and they're not likely to come back to one another again. Is there any chance that things could change, Mr. Yang?
Well, foreseeable future, I cannot see the probability to make substantive changes in terms of the program of the family reunion. For example, the South has been seeking for a very long time, seeking for regularized activities of the reunion, but because of the complicated political reasons from the North, the two sides haven't got agreement about that. But this time, I think it's more hopeful than before that the two sides can strike an agreement to regularize, although we haven't seen any indicators about that. At least the improved atmosphere will help both the North and the South toward this positive direction to make the reunion more easily, as our South Korean colleagues mentioned.
Of course, Mr. Walsh, this is a process. If the family reunions continue in the future in different rounds, this is a process of building trust between the North and the South. This is also a process of building the real texture, which has already been existing there anyway on the Korean Peninsula between the peoples living on both sides of the border. So will that bring, many hope, some real change in temperatures between the North and the South, even politically, even in the other areas?
Well, I think it can help, and it can certainly build a constituency, a popular support for this slow process of normalization and exchange between the two sides. But I think it's basically going to be decided by the leadership. You know, if Chairman Kim wants to have these reunions, then we'll have them. If he doesn't, we won't.
And I also might point out it depends on the leadership in South Korea. Right now, South Korea has a president, President Moon, who has a very specific strategy in mind, and it's about building inter-Korean relations. Past South Korean presidents have taken a different point of view, and it's not clear what Mr. Moon's successor, in years to come, whether they will continue this policy. But as long as both leaders see it as in their interests and in their country's interests, then I think this continues. So can continue, and I think it may continue for a while. As we're in this process, because the other party here is the United States, and my guess is that Chairman Kim sees some advantage to maintaining a positive relationship with President Moon, if only because that helps with the U.S. relationship. So I think there are incentives to keep this going. How long? That's the question, and I don't know the answer to that.
And of course, the locations of the family reunion could also be an issue in the future, Ms. Lim. If this family reunions continue, it seems that the momentum is pointing to that direction. Like there could be future rounds. We don't know, of course. But if it could continue, could the locations of the family reunion tell us much more about the real evolvement of the relationship between the North and the South?
Of course, I partially agree with the other panelist, Mr. Walsh. Of course, as long as there are common interests between us, of course, we'd love to have more and more reunions. But I personally do think this is just beyond our common interest issue. This is more than that. This is actually, I think, a human rights issue. And as long as the majority of the separated family members are aging rapidly, I think we really, regardless of political interests or regardless of any other thing, I personally truly hope we can keep this momentum toward the routine, even like a routinization of the family reunion, or even exchanging letters, or like even virtual in these days. I mean, the 21st century, even the virtual reunion is possible too. So I truly hope we can have that kind of things. But here, one thing I really have to add is, of course, family reunion is one thing, but it cannot actually be the all that, how would you say, that will solve all this, difficult problems that we have today.
Right.
But again, I truly hope we can keep this momentum towards the further direction.
As all of you have indicated, the family reunion is only part of the picture when it comes to the relations across the border between the North and the South. There's much more concrete issues over there. For example, particularly, I mean, when it comes to national interest, South Korea at this point apparently is taking trust-building measures with the DPRK, so will withdraw from 10 guard posts that are within 8 kilometers of the border. South Korea and the United States will also suspend their routine August military exercises. These, of course, are some of the talking points that both Seoul and Washington would like to use. But Mr. Yang, do you think these will help Pyongyang to have a more determined mind about the so-called good momentum on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, it's a very complicated question and followed by complicated measures from Pyongyang. I think on one hand, Pyongyang will strengthen the ties with the South by reducing military tensions, as you mentioned, reducing the guard posts, and with many other measures like hotlines, increased hotlines, and more exchanges between the militaries and the political level. But on the other hand, Pyongyang will slow down or control the pace of the dialogues with the United States on the nuclear. So I think with the positive gestures sent from the South, I think North will give feedbacks positively with more positive measures. But on the other hand, on the nuclear front, we have to witness some degree of deadlocks for a while till Trump administration make some changes on the existing policies.
Mr. Walsh, that is a question that I must go to you for an answer. We've seen the Singapore summit. All of us were participating in one way or another in reporting or reflecting about that summit. but eventually did not produce much yet. And it seems there's a tendency, as Mr. Yang just mentioned, on the one hand, interactions between the North and the South are increasing, and sometimes not just in quantity, but even in quality. But on the other hand, the dialogue between the United States and Pyongyang are actually cooling down rather than geared up following the summit. They are pointing fingers even at one another, particularly from Pyongyang to Washington, saying not necessarily the other side is responsible for what they're doing, what they're saying. So, Mr. Walsh, what kind of realities are we seeing, so-called warmer and colder?
Well, we're seeing both at the same time.
Yes.
I think my good friend Mr. Young is correct. There's going to be a tendency for North Korea to want to play this at their own pace. But we also need to step back and look at the big picture here. You know, this wasn't, Singapore wasn't your typical agreement. Normally in international relations, you have two countries, they negotiate for years. The Iran agreement took 3 years to negotiate. The leaders came in at the end and signed it. This is the opposite of that. They met first, and now the negotiation has to take place. So it's going to take time, and it's going to be difficult. And I'm encouraged to see that as of yesterday, the President has appointed a new special representative to North Korea. I think that will help. Mr. Pompeo is en route to North Korea with that new special representative. And I think, you know, one of the things the U.S. has to do is accept the old phrase, words for words, actions for actions. They can't expect North Korea to do everything up front and wait only till the end to get some sort of reward for it. So they're going to have to, North Korea wants things too. They want a peace agreement, they want other stuff. The sides are going to have to do it step at a time by reciprocity. That will take time, and it may take time beyond even this Trump administration.
Well, time is the thing, isn't it? It's always about the timing. Ms. Lim, there are two timing things that we have to ask you about. One is, of course, the DPRK is sophisticated about its understanding about the rest of the world, U.S. politics no exception. It understands very well that November midterm election and the legal battles Mr. Trump and his inner circle is having right now, how much it would help them in a way in their decision making of interacting with Washington. Secondly, time is important because in a way, midterm election could determine where U.S. politics is going, and therefore about the denuclearization process, how long and how much DPRK could do and should do. That's already making everybody happy. So having said that, though, Ms. Lim, how should we understand those timing things working both ways?
Yes, a very difficult question even for me too. Yes, you're right. In a short term, of course, we do have that midterm in November. And I personally do think Chairman Kim Jong-un understands this very well, at least compared to his father. I think he understands all this difficult dynamics in the liberal democratic society. Again, South Korea or Japan or the United States, we do have more like a variable, uncontrollable variable compared to their own regime or their own politics. So as long as Chairman Kim Jong-un understands that, that is what, again, what I think. As long as he understands that, I think and I hope he can show some substantial and concrete measures before the November election. And otherwise, it might be really difficult to keep, again, all this very rare chance, this rare momentum toward the further evolution. So that's what I really want to see within a couple of months. Yes.
However, on the other hand, Mr. Yang, President Trump used this Singapore summit as his political bargain, almost in a way, suggesting how great a president he is, be able to, you know, break the deadlock that previous president had never been able to do. However, it seems that after summit, nothing really happened, at least not in the public sphere. So what about leading up to the midterm election, given the fact also that the Trump administration is having a very tense relationship with many of its allies and also the earlier partners, such as China, when it comes to trade issues. So 6 parties, you see quite a number of parties quite upset about what is going on between them and the United States.
Well, I think originally President Trump really had timing sense. Say before the midterm election, he must get something from North Korea. But now I believe he gave up the hope or expectation simply because the gap of the expectation from Pyongyang between Pyongyang and Washington D.C. And Pyongyang simply saying Pyongyang put top priority at the new type of relationship between DPRK and USA, while U.S. put top priority at the denuclearization. So totally different, and I think the dialogue will remain there. So for near future, I don't see any possibility to make a breakthrough from the two sides.
Certainly, for this moment, we are so happy for those families who eventually, after decades, be able to be reunited, even just for 3 days. Looking at some of their photos. But anyway, very emotional moments. Thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us for this discussion. Yang Xiyu, Yun Zhang Lim, and Jim Walsh. Thank you so much and have a great weekend. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. The weekend is up. Do have a good one, everyone. Good night.